Howdy, howdy. Sue Devil here. In this episode of Dwarf Faction Focus Essential Units, we're going to start looking at infantry. It's a very big subject, and I'm going to tackle it in multi-parts. But before we get going, I wanted to update everybody on a few things that I've been testing and things that I've noticed and abilities that are actually stronger than I first thought. And the first thing I want to talk about is the Rune Smith, and that is this ability here, Rune of Wrath and Ruin. It only costs 70 gold, and you can cast it quite frequently. So it lasts for 10 seconds, and then it has a 45-second cooldown, so you can basically get it off once every minute. Normally I have just been using this mostly against the vampire counts, but it's actually a very strong ability, and some of the testing I did was against great swords and black orcs, and when you get that off on great swords or black orcs, it's actually going to reduce their health by about 1,000, and that's really significant. If you think going from 5,800 to about 4,800, you're looking at taking almost a fifth of their health. Now, you don't actually kill anybody with this ability because it takes the same health off the top, but you reduce the total health of that unit pretty significantly, and it allows your own units engaging them to get the route on or tackle them a lot faster. And if you look at the value of that, what's 1/5 of 1,000 is around 200, so maybe you're taking 150 gold worth of health off of these guys. Now, it would be better if you were actually killing units, but let's put it in terms of that. And 150 gold, this is only worth 69. So even if you get it off once, it's a good value. If you get it off 2 or 3 or 4 times, it can really snowball. And it's a good thing for your runesmith to have, because he's often sitting in the middle just getting off buffs. And if you're against a faction like Chaos and they bring something really powerful like these Chosen, that can be even more valuable. I know they have a lot more health, but it can really help start whittling them down, and they do take some morale damage from it as well. The second thing I wanted to talk about is Gyrocopters. Now, in my Essential Units 3, I talk about them lots and say that 2 Gyrocopters is probably the right number. I've since revised that, owing to the fact that a faction like Empire, they can come in and really do a lot of work against your Gyrocopters because they're generally going to have flying units. They can have outriders, things like that. So when it comes to your army setup against the Empire, I would highly recommend you don't use Gyrocopters because they're going to be extremely risky. And I have a couple of online battles or ladder battles, and one demonstrates that pretty clearly. The second faction is Bretonnia, and I think in my Bretonnia setup, I also don't have any Gyrocopters, and that's just because they can field Pegasus Knights, and they can have Luan Leoncoeur on a flying mount, and he's very strong because of his regenerating ability. It's just not worth it against Bretonnia. Now, against the vampire counts, I do maintain 2. Now, this is a little risky because they can field Fellbats, and they are a very good counter to these Gyrocopters, but I keep a unit of Quarrelers in this army to kite them back. Those Fellbats, with the exception of shutting down the Gyrocopters, are very, very weak, and all of your units can handle them quite readily. But if they don't have them, you really get a pretty big advantage, and I have a couple battles against the vampire counts showing these Gyrocopters going to work. Now, against the Beastmen, I think it's actually worth having 4 Gyrocopters and no artillery. They can summon those Cygors, which can be extremely effective against the Dwarfs, and so I don't think it's worth taking artillery, but you need something to deal with them. And just 2 gyrocopters can be a bit of a problem because they can summon manticores, and they can also have their Ungor raiders, I think, who are pretty quick, and even though they don't do a lot of damage, they can really harass. And that's why I've got these 2 gyrocopters, just the regular ones without the brimstone guns, because they're so strong against their skirmishers and their unarmored units. They're very useful to have in that army makeup. Now the other army I use 4 against is against Chaos. Now I used to have a unit of cannons in here, but I just found they weren't as effective. These can be much more effective because Chaos is got very few ways to deal with these gyrocopters. They can field the Marauder Horsemen with throwing axes, but you can rout them extremely fast. And these guys can make a big difference. They can use their bombs on the Forsaken, they can use their armor-piercing abilities on chosen or heavily armored units, they can chase down routing units to make sure they don't come back. The Chaos does have the ability to field a lot of large units, so 4 gyrocopters in this case I think can be very effective. So that's the update on gyrocopters, and now we'll go on to the Dwarf Infantry. Now in this first video talking about infantry, I'm not going to go in depth on any of the units because it's a pretty complex matter to review because a lot of it is based on matchups. So I'll go over the basics of your infantry, and if you've already watched some of my videos, you'll know that your Longbeards and your Longbeards with great weapons, these are going to be your 2 strongest infantry units. And the reason is they're just in that sweet spot in cost versus stats. They have 95 armor, shielded, and these guys also have 95 armor, and they have 47 melee defense. If you subtract 30 from that, that means anything with 17 melee attack or over, these guys will get full use of their melee defense. And they have that ability, Old Grumblers, which is really strong in multiplayer battles because it adds morale or leadership to your other units, and they start with very high leadership, so they tend to be really strong. And when you get that double buff, the double +8 melee buff from your Rune Smith and from Thorgrim, these Longbeards can hang in there with Black Orcs, Graveguard with great weapons, great swords. You know, they're a very cost efficient unit. So the makeup of your army should always include a lot of Longbeards. Now with respect to miners, I've only ever used them as a filler unit if I have some cash left at the end of my build. They're not really effective, but they can get in the way of other things, and they do have armor piercing, so if they have to fight a more heavily armored unit, at least they can get some damage in. The one unit I haven't played with a lot is miners with blasting charges. I have tried to set them up versus cavalry charges because I thought maybe they could use their blasting charges to slow down the cavalry, but they just can't get them off fast enough. I think the only good way to use them is to put them in the second row of your infantry and use your blasting charges from there, but I'm not sure of their total value. They might be good against the beastmen or the vampire count, something with more low armored units, because those blasting charges aren't super effective against armor. The dwarf warrior, they are useful, and that's just to get a few extra units on the field to cover your flanks. They really are not going to get much done in combat, but if you've seen some of my videos, they're pretty effective at just holding the line. They take a lot longer to kill than the miners do, or even the dwarf warriors with great weapons, so they really tie up enemy charges and units pretty effectively, and they have charge defense against large foes, so they're going to be good against cavalry. I mean, they're not going to kill them, but they're going to have a lot of greatly reduced incoming damage when they accept that charge. So they can be useful, and I do like to put them on my flanks or in my rear to just defend against cavalry. The dwarf warriors with great weapons, I have not found a really good use for these guys as of yet. So I can't see any situation where they're going to be effective, and they're getting close to these Longbeards. So it's hard to say. I think they're, in some of the analysis I've done, they might have some uses, but they're really not that great. Now, when we get past the Longbeards up into our top tier units, I do want to make special mention of Ironbreakers. And if you've seen my video on melee animation and combat testing, these Ironbreakers never, ever come close to getting that 1300 out of their value. They're very robust, they got great armor, they do have the 2 shots of blasting charges, and you would think they're good, but they just don't perform. And I would never at this point ever bring them for any reason. I cannot think of a good reason to ever bring these Ironbreakers, because they're so expensive, and they're really not going to perform up to that 1300 gold. And you can get 2 Longbeards instead, and these Longbeards are going to perform just about as good, or 1 unit of Longbeards versus the Ironbreakers. They're just that much different, and it has a lot to do with them just not having enough reach, and they get staggered lots, and they just don't perform. Now these 2 units, the Slayers and the Hammers, are key in some battles. The Slayers, despite not having armor piercing, they're so good against large. Like a 24 bonus versus large is a ton of damage, and they're very fast for a dwarf. 40 gold or 40 speed, so they can help fill in parts of your line. They're good or decent against enemy lords, because even though they can't put a ton of damage on them, they can get there fast enough to tie them up, so that if someone's trying to fly in, dive bomb you, and fly out, those Slayers can get in there, tie them up, and slow them down, which does add a lot of value. And they're not bad against cavalry, surprisingly. If you watch Turin, he does a lot of dwarf battles where he includes Slayers even against factions like Bretonia and the Empire, and uses them to pretty good effect against cavalry, even if just to tie them up. They do have that anti-large trait, but they don't have a lot of armor piercing, which is where they're weak, but they're really fast. They can fill in the line and do some work. The Hammer is a tough unit to consider how valuable it is. They are very strong. They will beat Black Orcs. They will beat Greatsword. They will beat Graveguard with great weapons. In a one-on-one combat, they're extremely effective. They kill very, very fast, but they're very expensive. And at that 1200, you're looking at getting close to fielding 2 units of Longbeards. So it's really hard to say if they're going to pull that value out in a battle. And one of the things you can do if you watch lots of online battles is you will see this effect where people bring very elite armies with elite troops, and they just lose because the opposing army can put 1 unit in front of these guys and 1 unit to flank them, and they can't stand up to that kind of pressure. And it's hard to say. I do occasionally use hammers, and I have some setups where I'm going to have hammers in my army because they're so powerful, but you have to be extremely careful about how you use them if you want to get the max value. And I don't know if you'd never want more than 2 units in your army, just ever, but there's a lot of places to put 1 unit of hammers in your army. So that's a basic summary of these units, and how I'm going to tackle this in my future units or future episodes of Essential Units is I'm going to look at very specific cases where these infantry will outperform what their value would expect them to do, and that will give you hopefully some good information when you set up your own armies as to which units you choose. Anyways, I hope you found that interesting, and I will see you soon.